live at that. Okay, excellent. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Schools Forum. We have a shortened agenda today. One thing that we do need to note before we do anything else is a key piece of information around the NEU vote on the facilities time. So I've tried to get the message around to as many people as possible since then, but we have been made aware that unfortunately it couldn't be on this particular agenda because Democratic Services have investigated, and as the school blocks budget, including all de-delegated areas, were agreed at the last Schools Forum meeting in November, and this is not a separate item on the January Schools Forum agenda, Schools Forum can't discuss this at the meeting today. So I have spoken with Paul Coles at the NEU to make sure that he's aware and have sent messages out to as many people as I could on this group. Forgive me if I've missed anyone. It was on the hoof in the middle of the normal school day as well. So apologies if I didn't get out there and that comes as a surprise to anyone. That will go, I believe, Scott, and correct me if I'm wrong, and Pete and Kevin, that will go on the June agenda where we have those specific items and those can come up there. But the unintended possible positive consequences, there's still more opportunity to discuss and get that right. Is there anything, Scott, you think I've missed or need to add on that?
No, thanks, Ash, for that. Other than we'll be talking about it at Primary Heads tomorrow. It'll be on the agenda there as well.
Fantastic, and it is on a subsidiary agenda tomorrow. Now, we have the Kingston private secondary heads as well tomorrow. So that means both tomorrow it will be done, and then hopefully we know where we're going moving forward. So I might give you a call after that meeting, Scott. Okay, Kevin, any apologies?
We have apologies from Hazel Moody, from Carol Buchanan, and from Neil Smith, who is subbed. Natalie Bennett is substituting for him.
Thank you, and welcome, Natalia. Any declaration of interest that we haven't previously declared? Okay. Kevin, number 3, members' attendance, specifically Ian.
Chair, just to note that Ian Keary has resigned and we need to replace him.
Fantastic. And if it can be noted that I think this would have been Ian's 11th year on Schools Forum, and to formally thank him for his sort of service and attendance and just fantastic hair. Number 4, minutes of the last meeting. So our last meeting was held online on the 19th of November. Is there anything that anyone wants to challenge in those meetings? Any questions around those meetings, or indeed, Kevin, any sort of conventional issues that we need to be aware of? Good afternoon, Sophie. Okay, good game remains a fast game. So that takes us on to our item, the Send Futures plan. Charis, I believe, is going to give an update here. We obviously have the presentation in Appendix A. So Charis, if you're happy to give that, please jump in.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ash. So I will assume, as always, that everybody's had the opportunity to read this, and you will know that we have regular updates regarding the Send Futures plan, which is our way of managing local performance and priorities, but also the oversight of the safety valve. And 3 things really for noting in this particular report is the performance against the safety valve, how we're implementing the Send Futures, and there's a bit of a progress about the cluster model pilot that we've been taking forward, and there is a little bit of progress on that across the past few weeks. So I'll just do a few highlights, headlines, and then I'm happy to have any questions from anybody. So you all know that the safety valve is coming to an end in 2025-26. As yet, we have not had any update or information about what happens after that. So we continue to kind of work with what we've got, and we've obviously secured the funding that we anticipated we would during that time. So it has been a helpful period of time, but we haven't been able to resolve the more systemic long-term financial sustainability as a result of that. We are, within Achieving for Children, submitting a response to the DfE call for evidence, which is looking at a response to try and create a sustainable SEND system, both financially but also for children and young people. So there's sort of 4 key areas in that, of which finance is one of them. And we are just pulling together our local authority response to it. I don't know if heads or anybody else is thinking of doing that. Other things that sort of come through in terms of what's happened recently, Chico has led a review of specialist resource provisions across primary and secondary. That isn't concluded yet. There are still some conversations and some decisions about a couple of SRPs within that needs more of a conversation. So he has sent some communication out, but that there's still work to be done before that is finalised across both phases. And obviously schools that have been directly involved in that will have had letters, and I know he's got some meetings planned too. In terms of performance, you will see the EHC plans in Kingston. There was a 12% increase, which is important to realise that was in the last 12 months, but that was 12% on the 10% increase the previous year. So that's not, you know, that's showing a year on year increase. And within that, 27% of those requests were from parents and carers. Not any specific trends within that, but significant increases across all aspects. There's also a reference to the Care Calc banding tool, which is another piece of work which we're taking forward across the SEND system. And we are developing our communication for that, both for schools, for SENCOs, but also for parents and carers, because it's really important that everybody understands what that is, and that some of the concerns or perhaps myths that might be out there are allayed as well. So we've got an update in primary heads tomorrow. We've also got some comms going out, and Scott's coming to talk about that as well. So there's ongoing communication about that specific project too. The cluster pilot we've had, so the working group has met a couple of times. We have the advert out at the moment. It closes on Monday for the cluster lead. I've had lots of conversations with prospective candidates who are very interested in it, as we expected. I would say a really strong level of interest from really, you know, people with great caliber. So actually I feel optimistic that we should be able to make a good appointment who can then work with us locally to take that forward. So interviews are in February. The working party have got a small group who will be doing that. That process will be a task as well as an interview presentation, and then we'll be able to work with that person to take the kind of details in the summer forward for the 1-year pilot. So there has been some activity in that respect. There's quite a lot of sort of bigger projects going on at the moment. In terms of the SEND Futures plan, we've got the usual themes that span the work streams in terms of participation. Really important, our participation team is back up and running. Continued focus on independence. A lot of your schools came to the Access All Areas event, which was really good with a lot of employers and college, and really looking at purposeful next steps for young people with SEND. Commissioning, we continue the activity we've got, but negotiations and I suppose looking at, you know, buying in bulk cost, you know, some of those potential fee increases and challenging to them becomes more and more difficult as time goes on, particularly with the independent sector and shortage of places. But any gain we can make, even 1 or 2%, is a really big difference for us. And in terms of workforce, we have the SEND Futures Conference, and we've got some other conferences planned for SENCOs, teaching assistants, and regarding neurodiversity. So continuing to try and kind of upskill and look at the colleagues we have within the SEND system. So there are the usual 3 work streams: early intervention and identification, big focus on AP, the Old Malden Family Hub, and we finally got the pre and post diagnostic team working, sort of beginning to take referrals. You know that referrals for neurodiversity and ADHD assessments are years now for children, young people to be on those waiting lists. So trying to look at some of that pre-diagnostic support to help children, young people and families while they wait is a really important priority for them, the young people and their families, in terms of managing that period. And sort of staffing challenges, particularly in the visiting team. Continue in that one. Local offer, ongoing challenges regarding opening of new free schools, provision. There is very little activity from the DfE. Deadlines continue to be missed, and we're now talking about longer than we anticipated for the permanent site, the spring school. So that's very difficult indeed for everybody. We're looking at enhancing our post-16 offer, which is really good, and particularly with college and Malden Oaks, and making sure we get those pathways right. I talked about autism weights, and we had a little bit of additional capacity for 0 to 5s, but those waiting times are very significant, and we're working with ICB and South West London colleagues to think what can we do. It's not just Kingston and Richmond, that's a national issue. In terms of assessment and planning, you'd be pleased to know we have a second permanent designated clinical officer appointed. So we'll have one in Kingston and one in Richmond. So they start full-time from February. We've got a new person in our quality assurance role, which is working well. Annual reviews are now a second national performance indicator. So it's not just 20 weeks assessment. Annual review performance will now be monitored nationally as well. So we will need to have a big focus on that, not just within the SEND system, but schools responding within expected timescales for annual reviews and amends and all of that too. So that will become national data as things go on, but everybody is a bit challenged by that at the moment. And the SEND system is moving to a new liquid logic database, which we hope will help with some of that annual review activity and timescales. And in time, there's a flag there that we want to move towards a digital EHC needs assessment plan model. But again, we've sort of got quite a lot of big activities going on at the moment. So that will be sort of progress, I think, over probably the next academic year. So as always, Ash, there's a lot going on, a lot of activity, some quite big projects that are, you know, in train. And, you know, quite a lot going on nationally, but in terms of clarity, I would say we're not quite clear yet of what's happening next around safety valve. And I think the call for evidence will be really interesting in terms of hopefully providing a national steer that we've waited for a very, very long time since we had the SEND and AP review. Happy to have any questions.
Sean?
It's not so much a question, Charles. I think it's a concern, and I've raised it with you previously, and I've raised it with GK, but I think it's pertinent to raise at this forum. Given that we don't know what's going to happen with safety valve, given that we know there is national change coming on the horizon, I am concerned about making lots of local changes around SRPs and care calc, and all the work that entails both for you and for us in schools. And then there is the potential for us just to have to repeat all that work again in maybe 18 months, 2 years time. I worry what the impact that might have on local provision. And I wonder whether there is a sense that we should pause until we have a better understanding of what the national picture is going to look like, both around safety valves and around those national changes, which we definitely know are coming.
Well, I think I understand all, I understand those concerns, and I don't think we feel that anything that is being taken forward from anything that I've heard is conflicting with. There's a very clear national message about strength of mainstream provision, which definitely, Sean, includes, the confidence and the investment in specialist resource provisions. And actually, I was in a DfE meeting today, and they talk a lot about that model being a really big part of mainstream confidence and upskilling. So certainly the investment in SRPs and making sure that the SRPs that we have reflect the needs that we have and really clear pathways for children and young people. I don't think that's a conflict and a potential that I can't see any flags of how that's not aligned with what is happening nationally. And I certainly think with Care Calc, we are certainly, the messages that here, and Scott might know more from a financial point of view, but looking much more at a school-based provision model rather than individual pupil model, which is the model that Care Calc encourages you to do, looking at the provision to meet a child's needs rather than hours or allocation, and thinking about how you would use that funding within your school for predictive needs, groups of children, specialisms that one or two children might have, as I know a lot of schools do. So yeah, I agree with you that, you know, we want to keep an eye on what's happening nationally, but I don't think we're doing anything so radical in Kingston that's going to be contradictory. But anyone else is happy to. Scott, you know, I don't know if you want to say anything about care calc. You'd be more involved with it from the outset, but I don't feel that that direction is radically changing either the amount of money schools are going to get, but it is encouraging schools to look at a more school-based model rather than a pupil-by-pupil model, which I think is better and will help to develop this kind of mainstream school confidence that is certainly the national picture moving forward.
Thanks, Charis. Councillor Waring, I recognise you've got your hand up, but if Scott, you don't mind jumping in on that to extend.
Yeah, just a quick one regarding the finances around care calc. The current projections are that we would be spending around £110,000 more than we currently do within the mainstream settings. There are winners and losers within that we need to discuss, and I'll be discussing more at primary heads tomorrow. But I need to make this really clear. The care calc system, the point of it was never to save money. The point of it was exactly how Charis has described it. It's a needs-led system. So I think we just need to make that clear within this forum. But yeah, so the current projections are showing a £110,000 increase in funding within the mainstream settings.
Thank you, Scott. Sean, is there anything else on that you wanted to dive in on before I go to Councillor Waring?
Yeah, I guess it wasn't just necessarily about reducing funding. It was more about having to replicate work. And if we're having to do that now and then again later, but Charis feels fairly confident that this is following the messaging from government. I guess we just have to be, you know, confident in that reading of the room.
I mean, we have had a very clear steer over a number of years, particularly from some specialist resource provisions, that historic models and SLAs were really not working, and it had been put off for quite a long time, Sean, or kind of, you know, thought about differently. So I think it was a position that we needed to take forward, particularly for some of the primary SRPs, where for our youngest children, they're beginning to see that really different change in need, and we need to make sure we get some of those pathways right. So I think it was something that we couldn't keep holding on to and just waiting to see what if. And I do feel confident that, you know, getting the SRP model and pathways right in mainstreams is a big part of what will be happening nationally moving forward. If I'm not, you'll have to come back and challenge me on that, Sean. You said.
Kevin's minuting it right now, Charis. Councillor Waring?
Thanks, Ash. Charis, you mentioned the permanent site for the spring school. You didn't mention the new secondary school in Norbiton. What's the latest in the DfE on that?
So the DfE have reviewed are in the process of reviewing all 44 previously approved free schools, and that site is one of them. So they are still completing that piece of activity, and we asked them today for a time scale, and it's sort of loosely around springtime. So you can take what you will from that. But at the moment, all 44 are still under review and no decisions have been made regarding long-term plans. Will they or won't they go ahead? Or will they go ahead but very far down the line? Or will they just be at this point in time a no? So we're waiting for decision on 3 schools, the Surbiton Primary, the kind of Kingsmeadow Secondary, and a secondary in Richmond. They're all 3 part of that 44 review.
Thanks.
Councillor Waring, are you responding to that?
Yeah, just a very quick follow-up. Thanks for that, Charis. And what are we expecting out of the review? Is it just a yes, carry on, or no, or yes?
It will be, from what I have been told, there will be some that are a definite no. We can see no need ever. There are some that are maybe a definite yes, and there are some that are possible, but at this point in time we want to keep it on hold, and we'll revisit when we look at projected birth rates and numbers in the next couple of years, because you said you might need it in 5 years' time. So I think it will be those 3 types of decision, but there's not a lot of detail and kind of timescale and clarity coming out yet.
And just to add to that, Councillor Waring, just for transparency and honesty, Kingston heads have written to inform the DFE and indeed Bridget Phillipson that based on the numbers, based on where we are, that we remain in the view that we don't believe that that school, based on numbers, is required. So I think that's just important to be clear on. Esther.
Thank you. I can even feedback now or do it when we move on to the next item. Just two thoughts linked to the matters raised under the previous report. I'm picking up on Sean's point there. One of the concerns or one of the discussion pieces that was in the targeted high needs is in this really challenging time is picking the pace with that SRP review balanced against what may happen in the future. And that was quite a lengthy discussion in that meeting. And for that reason, attached to the minutes are all the task and finish group minutes as well, which is not just people from forum as well, so that information is there for us all to see, because it is really challenging decisions. And I think what we heard really clear in that meeting, that there is that fairly urgent need for reviewing of SLAs, as Charis has said, where in the primary phase in particular, there is some significant underfunding to meet the needs, and balancing that with the pace to carefully consider maybe some of the other SRPs at secondary. And so maybe a two-phased, it's getting that balance with the pace is something I think everybody's very mindful of, because obviously the knock-on effect, if primary needs are not met, it will have a huge impact on the secondaries as well. But recognising the secondary model needs further consideration to ensure all areas of need are met, and that band 2 as well. So that's bridging into the next part, Ash, but I just wanted to respond to that. And then on Scott's point with the care calc, I think one of the things, and as we're always aware, talking at high needs, we don't have any decision making, but care calc was an AFC decision. I think one of the things we hold in mind always is that if we do move to a cluster model, how we always ensure that we are progressing more towards how do we meet whole groups of needs rather than an individually driven system. And I think I think it's fair to say we all hold that in mind in that group, because that was something that Peter Gray had mentioned as well. And sorry, Ash, that's bridging into the next point, but it kind of links to this point as well.
I think they call it a neat segue in show business, so I don't think that's the worst thing. And thank you for those. Any more questions specifically related to the Send Futures plan? And Charis, thank you for that update and the work that's going into it. It's clear that we're there, and it's clear that we're waiting on, external factors with that 740 million, with how. And I think it's important when Scott speaks a little later that we're really conscious of there have been those broad political promises, but they are being rolled into our ALPRU and our NFF. And I think those things are all there. But any other questions specifically on the Send Future plan before Esther and maybe Sophie? Forgive me, I know I didn't reply to that email, my apologies. Update on the high needs block subgroup. Okay, Esther, Sophie, anything on that?
Do you want us to start on the
Please, thank you.
Yeah, perfect.
I'll start. For some reason I got quiet, which is not something I'm normally accused of. So Esther, Sophie, please, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, stop. Chair, could we just note the issues on the report, just for the record?
Yeah, so the three things that we had to note were the performance against the safety valve agreement, which we have noted and questioned, the progress with the implementation of the Send Future plan, which we have noticed and questioned, and the progress made by the task and finish group on the Kingston cluster model pilot, which we have noted and questioned. There's nothing to be noted or questioned on this next agenda, which is a verbal update on the high needs block subgroup. Thank you, Kevin. Esther.
Thank you. If I start, and Sophie, if you're happy to chip in as well, a little bit of a repeat over what we've just covered. In targeted high needs, we meet 3 times a year, and as we mentioned, it's not a decision-making group. And at the moment, we are receiving and looking at some quite weighty projects that are happening across Kingston. So very mindful that we, in an hour and a half, covering 3 very big areas, is quite a lot to listen into. And that's why, as I mentioned again, the task and finish group minutes are all attached into this agenda as well, because I think that's really helpful, that even if you haven't got an SRP, it just gives a real context behind the needs of Kingston and how we all move forward together. Scott, in the last targeted high needs group, gave us a very clear financial overview, and obviously with the safety valve going, we do know there is some additional funding coming in, but that will stop in March 26. That's right, Scott?
March 25.
March 25 for
Yeah.
the safety valve, but the increase of funding, the indication is after March 26, it drops to the 3%.
That's it.
So we know we're not, we've got, you know, real challenges ahead. The challenges remain. Targeted high needs came out of the safety valve and look at really shining the light on the funding there. And one of the things that we felt was to continue, and Scott felt was important, was to continue with the targeted high needs and the reporting like we have received since the safety valve, because that's really shone the light on the areas of spend. In summary, we did talk about the call for evidence, and I think the general feeling was the Trust will be sending in and AFC will be sending in. If people feel strongly that they'd like a collective response, I'm happy to support with that. But otherwise, I think trusts and schools will be sending in individuals' responses to that, to have our voice into the system and to also to support the change that's needed is really important. So really aware of the financial risks. We have been looking at 3 key areas, and one of the areas that keeps is coming up in terms of the CCG is the concerns around therapy and the lack of therapy, particularly for at all levels actually, but in terms of EHCPs not getting their statutory provision as well, and that's something that remains a focus, because that does filter into the education costs as well, and potentially the escalation of need. And I think, Charis, you mentioned in the last meeting that it's also a trigger for so many of the tribunals. I think that was right. I seem to remember that. So that's one element that we always ask into reporting, because we're conscious that is very closely linked to escalating costs as well. The second big focus is looking at the rolling out of the banding that started at special schools, and that again isn't a decision made at the group, but looking at the implications and the complications for that. A particular focus in the last meeting was really about the SRP review, and quite again repeating a little bit here about mixed views around that, because it's balancing that need where some schools are so underfunded that the sustainability in meeting primary needs is putting that at risk, and balancing that with the pace of change and considerations at secondary. I think there was a feeling, and Sophie, you might want to add to that, that we really need to raise the awareness amongst all head teachers for that. And I know, Scott, you're speaking tomorrow, if that's right, as well, to raise the awareness of those issues there. Because obviously any changes to SRPs will have an impact for all schools across Kingston, not just those with SRPs. Really mindful that that's a huge piece of work, taking a huge amount of everybody's time, but a much needed piece of work to get right, and hearing about really what long term, if the government does really sort out SEND provision and give extra funding, I guess it's making sure we don't make those decisions now that we regret in the longer term, ensuring all needs are met. And the third area is focusing on the cluster project, which I know Charis has covered. And Sophie, do you want to add a little bit more to that, or anything that we have missed? Just to draw your attention as I finish, it's well worth reading all the task and finish groups minutes as well. Sophie, do you want to add about the cluster or anything? Charis covered it as well, but I don't know if you want to add a little more.
Only to say that, you know, making really strong progress on it. I'm delighted to hear that we've got some strong applications pending, and we've got a date locked in for interviews, and we're looking forward to a point. We should, you know, really hit the ground running after the Easter break with an appointment, so that the work can start in earnest. So we've made really good progress, and my thanks to AFC colleagues and those that are working on that cluster pilot group.
Thank you, guys. Are there any questions? I've got one, but any questions from anyone else on the high needs? Just with the interview, Esther, Sophie, Charis, are we? I remember there being some parameters in terms of who it might be. Are these external people? Are they Kingston people? Just for
in terms of the panel or the applicants?
Applicants.
Applicants. So there's been an emphasis on having colleagues apply from outside of the borough, so that there's a degree of objectivity that they bring to the role, which we feel in terms of the optics and actual implementation of the project is essential.
Yeah, I thought that was the case. Thank you, Sophie. Any other questions specifically on the subgroup? Okay, thank you everyone, and thanks everyone, because all of those subgroups and everything else are technically people are doing them for free, right? So thank you all so much for doing them. That takes us then, Scott, is this you, to the finance update. So the finance update is Appendix B, I believe, in everyone's packs. So there is no vote on this specifically. We have sort of two things recommended: that we note the latest DSG allocation for 24-25 financial year, and we note the projected DSG outturn provision for the 24-25 year, and look specifically, really, that table in 3.1 is really useful. But Scott, I'll hand over to you.
Brilliant, thanks, Ash. So as Ash has already noted, that we've got two things that we just need to discuss in this report. It's the usual report that comes to all schools forums, and I'm just going to run through it on the screen, just because numbers on the screen just make a lot more sense than me just saying numbers out loud. So let's start with this table in 3.1. So this is our DSG allocation for 2024-25. It's 97.819 million after recoupment. This has changed from the last time we spoke to Schools Forum back in November. It was 97.486 million, so it's increased by 333,000. The main reason for this increase is an increase in the early years block of 292,000. That's due to an increase in early years census places. It always changes the early years block based off of those census places. The next table I would like to talk about is this table in 4.1. So this is our outturn position for 2024-25. We're showing a forecast DSG spend of 7.189 million, down from 7.242 million as an overspend. So this is a reduction of 53,000 compared to the last form. So it's very little change compared to what we last reported. The high needs box specifically, I always like to talk about, is now at 7.689 million overspend. This was 7.651 million in the previous report back in November, so an increase by 38,000. So again, a very small change compared to what we discussed in November. All this means that we have a cumulative overspend in the DSG of 7.917 million. So this is an increase from 2023-24 of 3.199 million. So it was 4.718. It's increased to 7.197. Remember, that includes the 1.59 million that Charis has already alluded to with the safety valve funding that we received this year, and it includes the 2.4 million that we get from council funding. In 2025-26, both those amounts disappear, so we will see a true increase from 2025-26. There's nothing to offset it by. I think that's worth noting. We've already sort of mentioned this. Charis has already sort of stolen my thunder on this, but Kingston has received the last lot of safety valve funding. We've got all the money that we had in that 5-year plan. That 30 million has been fully received, and the agreement, as we've already said a couple of times, the agreement ends in March 2025. So the last thing I just wanted to mention is actually in this line here in 4.2. Again, Charis mentioned the number of EHCPs increasing, but I think it's worth saying again, EHCPs are up 182 since March 2024, so this financial year. That's a further 29 since we last reported back in November. So between October and now, we've received an extra 29 additional EHCPs. I think that's just worth mentioning, that they continue to rise. Now up to nearly 2,000 EHCPs in Kingston. So just going back to what we need to note. So We need Forum to note the latest DSG position of 97.819, and we need Forum to note the projected DSG outturn position, which is 7.189 million overspent.
Thanks, Scott. Before we do that, obviously, any questions or queries on anything that Scott just said there with regards to the finance update? Rachel, 7 at 9.
It's just a comment. I'm not surprised about the increase in the HCPs. The need that we're seeing within schools is huge. So it doesn't surprise me at all. And I know there's lots of work being done about SEN support, all these lots of things, but there are still children out there who are going to need an EHCP.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. The numbers are, well, I know there's nothing we can do at the moment, but yeah, completely agree. Anything else on that specifically? Obviously, I had written in my notes literally to ask the usual safety valve question, but I think Charis answered that earlier, so I'm not going to do that. But I was going to ask the usual what we're doing and how likely we are, but that's been answered. Any other specific questions on the finance update, everyone? Well, Scott, that's a lot of work for about 3 minutes airtime, but thank you so much for the work that you've gone into that and putting that in, and it's really appreciated. Kevin, can we please note that the forum has noted the latest DSG allocation for the 24-25 financial year. While no questions, we have noted that we recognise the impact of the significant increase in education, health and care plans and the impact that's having on schools, and that we note the projected DSG outturn position for the 24-25 financial year, and that it is sort of broadly in line. Okay, so Scott, is point 8 you again?
Mel will kick things off, and then I'll chip in later on to talk about early years.
Okay, so in this part, which I believe is Appendix C, which is the budget update, and just another reminder, the budget for last year was set, which is why we are not able to discuss the NEU facilities time. This one, the only part of the budget to be finalised is the early years block, based on the per hour rating shifts that the government have put in place, and that Scott and Mel and the team have worked hard to match and indeed beat in this. So what we have to do as part of this, and again, Mel, when I inevitably mess it up, I'm sure you will say, is that we have to note quite a few things, and then at the end we need to agree the early years central items. While you are looking at that, please note the late material 2, which was the survey responses to the questions on the early years, which all bar the last question were overwhelmingly 70% plus in terms of positive. So while we are all online, if you can look at that at the same time while multitasking with Mel, if you haven't had the opportunity, important to note as well. Mel, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much. So yeah, I'm Mel Hanson, Schools Finance Business Partner, and I'm going to present the schools block part of this report. This is the 25-26 budget report, and I'll hand over to Scott for high needs and early years. Just to note that the DFE issued the DSG allocations later than usual. They normally come in late December, but there's normally some indicative earlier in the year. We didn't get those last year. So the first we saw was in late December, and the authority pro forma tool that's mentioned in this report, referred to as the APT, the deadline for submission is tomorrow. So this just sort of runs through what's in there, most of which was agreed at forum in September and November. I just wanted to draw your attention to some particular sections of the report. So I've shared my screen. So if we look at 4.1, which is on page 21, we've got the indicative DSG allocation there. So we've got it broken down by the different blocks. Schools block 143.551 million, central school services at 1.099, high needs block at 34.796, and the early years at 28.274, with a total indicative allocation there of 207.720 million. And then the next table that we're going to look at on page 22 shows how the breakdown is a little bit misleading at a first glance. So at first glance, it looks like the allocation has increased by 19.313 million when compared to 24-25. But once we take out changes to population, the roll-in of some non-DSG grants and extended duties in the early years that Scott will refer to later, it's actually 5.814 million increase. So not the 19 that it looks like at first glance. So on this table here on page 22, in 4.3, we can see that breakdown. So it's got the 24-25 allocations here, our 25-26 adding up to the 207.720 million total, and then the change is broken down. So we can see that 1.844 million relates to that's a decrease in population. We had 7.706 million rolled in of non-DSG grants. So that's broken down at the bottom of this table. We've got the teachers' pay grant, teachers' pension grant, and the core schools budget grant. All of those have now been rolled in, which sort of inflates that overall figure. And then the change due to extended duties in the early years is the 7.637 in the final column of that table, which, sorry, I'll just make that a bit larger for you.
Thank you, Mel.
Okay, so that gives us this overall 5.814 million real terms increase due to additional funding when compared with 24-25. The next bit I wanted to refer to is 5.13. I'm just going to go down a bit again, which is on page 24. So this is the de-delegated per pupil rates we've got here now that we've got the final census numbers. So a breakdown in this de-delegation budget table on page 24 shows us the behaviour support budget of 283,000, equating to £30.96 per pupil. Support to underperforming ethnic groups and bilingual learners, 138,000, which equates to £15.08 per pupil. And the safeguarding training at 8,000, which equates to 90p per pupil. And then the block transfers, which are mentioned in 5.14, still on page 24 of this report. These were all agreed in Schools Forum in September, but we'll just run through those again. So there was 200,000 for the Targeted High Needs Fund, 130,000 for school improvement, 102,000 for primary education inclusion, 74,000 for secondary alternative provision, and 124,000 for the cluster model. And in November, Schools Forum considered and agreed to the maximum amount transfer equating to 0.5%. And at that time, it was agreed at up to £43,000 was going to be transferred based on those indicative figures. That figure it increased, but we've kept that at the 43,000 that was agreed by Schools Forum in November. I also wanted to mention the disapplication, which we discussed in November as well, with the exceptional circumstances item of Tolworth. Just to mention that was rejected at the first stage when we submitted a disapplication request to the Secretary of State due to the threshold being below what was considered exceptional circumstances. So there are ongoing discussions between the authority, AFC, and the school about how that's going to be funded, because that is no longer going to be an exceptional funding through the DSG as it has been historically. And then I wanted to take you to Appendix B, which is on page 36 of this report. This shows the indicative school by school allocations. It's important to flag that the second to last column here is not actually comparing like for like due to those roll-in of the grants. Scott and I did have a look at this to see if we could do that on a school level. It wasn't as quick and easy as it seems. So at the moment, we've just got that overall that we talked about earlier in the big table that shows us it was only 5 million increase on like for like with last year after the roll in of grants, but we haven't got it broken down by school level at this stage. So that is not really a true indication of those percentages there. But if we do take the final column of the MFG changes, I just wanted to point out that any school that's got 0% on here was likely below the MFG level that we set at 0% at Schools Forum in November. So they've been brought up, uplifted. And anyone at 0.68, that's where the level of capping, so they were likely over, but anything above 0.68 has been capped to then uplift those schools that were under. And anyone that's in between 0% and 0.68, there's been no change. That's just what they were, and there's no change to what they would get under the MFG there. And then if we go to 9.1, section 9.1 of this report, I just wanted to draw your attention to this table here, which just shows that the allocation, this is the indicative allocation in the first column as set by the DfE. We are allowed to do some internal movements. These were agreed at Schools Forum previously, and they're broken down in the middle column, which then shows we've still got the same allocation. It's just that we've moved some of those funding amounts from the schools block, central school services block, and early years to support the high needs block as it's a local priority, all of which was agreed at the previous forums. But I just wanted to draw your attention to that table there. And then I will hand over to Scott to talk you through the high needs and early years.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mel.
Thank you, Melanie. Scott, do you want to go and then we'll do questions as one collaborative at the end?
Yeah, that's excellent. Thanks, Ash. I'm just going to share my screen as well, just so I'm in control of moving it around. Hang on, here we go. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the high needs block. Hopefully my screen is sharing now. Here we go. There's not a lot to say in the high needs block. There's no change from the discussions that we had at last forum regarding the per pupil rate. We got it right, essentially. Like our estimations were correct once we got the indicative figures from the ESFA at the end of December. The only thing that's changed is the population has gone down, as Mel's always sort of alluded to. So we had a decrease in the high needs block population of 164. That's in paragraph 7.3, which is on the screen here, showing that decrease. So let's talk about early years. So we've got a couple of things that we need to talk about within the early years. We need to, as Ash has already said, we need to actually vote on agreeing the central items. And we also need to make it, Schools Forum needs to make a recommendation regarding the proposals for the early years funding that's within this report. So if we start on paragraph 8.2, which is here, these are the rates of increase that we receive from the ESFA for each individual line. The early years block is different this year. It started to change September last year. Let me make this a little bit bigger if I can. They've split it now into 3 different age range categories: 3 and 4 year olds, 2 year olds, and under 2 year olds. We received an increase of 27p in the 3 and 4 year olds, a 41p in the 2 year olds, and 59p in the under 2s. We go down to table 8.8 here. These are the proposed increases that we're saying to these providers. So instead of the 27p that we received, we're proposing to increase the 3 and 4 year olds by 31p. The 2 year olds, we're proposing to, instead of being 41p, to be 60p. And the under 2s, instead of being 59p, it will be 75p. So higher than the allocations that we received. Now, the reasons behind that is because we have a passport rate. This passport rate needs to be 96%. As you can see from these 3 here, we're nearly at 97% for all of those categories. We want to be ahead of the curve here. So although the ESFA is 96% is what they're suggesting, next year we know that's going to be 97%. We would already be ahead of that, ensuring that we transfer 97% of the entire early years block out to providers. I'll talk about what the rest of that 3% is in a second. It's all to do with central items. Let's go to table 8.4. So table 8.4. The central items here, these 4 central items. As Ash alluded to, the late material from the consultation showed the responses that we've received. I think we had 54 responses from providers. All 4 of these were above 70% yes. So the early years advisory service, 72.7% in favour, with 94.5% either in favour or not sure. Home visit services for children, which is Portage, 81.8% are in favour, with 94.5% either in favour or not sure. Therapies, we had 70.9% in favour, with 85.4% in favour or not sure. And the high need support for children with EHCPs, 79.2% in favour, with 96.2% either in favour or not sure. With regards to the setting of the rates that we've just talked about, that as I said, are higher than what we've received from the SFA as an increase, we had 52.7% in favour of the rates going up, 69.1% were in favour or not sure. I just wanted to mention some of the comments that we had. I think it's quite important to mention them here. We had a few providers that mentioned an £8 per hour rate for 3 and 4 year olds and for 2 year olds. That is simply not possible for the 3 and 4 year olds within the amount of money we receive from the SFA. I think that's just worth noting here, although it's a fair comment within the consultation response, but it's not a possibility within the early years block to set an £8 rate for the 3 and 4 year olds. So the only other thing that I wanted to note really was in 8.13, which is to do with the early years pupil premium. This doesn't affect the overall early years block allocation. It's passported in, it comes in from the SFA and goes immediately out again in totality, but the rate has increased from 68p per hour to £1 per hour. So quite a big increase in the early years pupil premium rate. So in summary, from an early years block perspective, we need to have a vote on agreeing these central items, these 4 here. 241,000 for the early years advisory service, 124,000 for the portage, 130,000 for therapies, 225,000 for high need support for children with EHCPs, overwhelmingly over 70% agreeing to all of those, and then make recommendations regarding the rate increases that we've already suggested. Thanks, Ash.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you for putting forward something that you're moving you could be holding on to the 4%, but you're moving towards the 97%. And I think that's really, really positive. And thank you guys for doing that, for redeploying that to our kids. Before I go on to do the questions and the notes, any questions from anyone on the forum about what Scott and Melanie have put forward with regards to the early years? Okay. So we need to note the financial year allocation. Before we do that, can I just ask one or two things, because I'm that way. So what is next with the Tolworth Girl thing? We said that people are talking about it. What does that mean? So what's going to happen this time next year? Just a reminder for anyone that wasn't on forum before, 100 years ago, when Tolworth had everything redesigned, there was a cost put for because the access to the rec and the access to the gym and things. Where are we with that? What does that look like for this forum?
Thanks, Ash. I'll pick up Mel. You correct me if I'm wrong here, because I might well be, but it cannot be funded from the DSG. The Secretary of State has made that perfectly clear. So we won't be coming back to ask you as a schools forum to put that as a dedelegation item or an exceptional circumstance moving forward, because it cannot happen. So there's discussions need to be between the council, we'll be facilitating as AFC, and the school to work out a way forward, but it can't be coming back to schools forum.
Fantastic, thank you for that. And then one self-indulgent note is the schools forum was quoted in a recent consultation in terms of the minutes of where we said the school places were needed. So to that end, I'd just like to note that looking at one of the appendices, what you've just shown us that we are 287 children fewer in Kingston than we were previously. Is that correct, Melanie, based on that document that you sent, that you showed through the appendix with the MFG on it? Scott?
Yes, actually 301 fewer. It didn't pick up the final school, which dropped by 14. So actually just an amendment to that appendix, 301 fewer.
So we have the equivalent of an entire primary school, fewer children in Kingston than we had previously.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, if I can go in the minutes, that'll be incredibly helpful. Any further questions in with regards the items that Mel and Scott have gone through? Then we'll do through the notes. Okay, so we note the financial year allocation for the DSG, the schools block, central services block, high needs block, and early years group block. We note the 2025 APT submission and proposed rates for the factors within the local formula. We note the de-delegated per funding rate and indeed the rolling in of those rates with the NFF and the nationally promised amounts, and we await what the nationally promised amounts look like versus an ORPU and the NFF, and in terms of real terms increases. We note the outcome of the exceptional item disapplication in relation to Tolworth Girls' School, and we note that that won't come back to the forum and it won't be part of the, it cannot be taken from the DSG. And we note the indicative school by school allocations. So I'm going to take this part in two items if everyone's okay, and please disagree if you think that. The majority of the questions that came through in terms of the late materials were over a 70% agreement. So if everyone's okay with the 55 respondents as a representative sample and the 70+ agreement, I'm going to ask if we're okay to vote on question 1, 2, 3, and 4 as a group, given that all of them were above 70%. So question 1, just to reiterate, Scott, and I'm sorry, I know you said it, had a positive response of 72.7 with 21.8 stating they didn't know. Question 2 is 81.8 positive response with 12.7% saying no. Question 3 was 70.9 with 14.5% saying no, and 79.2% on question 4 with 17%. Has anyone got any objections to me bringing those all in together as one? Okay, so the question for the vote, please raise your hand on the virtual raise your hand. Do we wish to proceed with the recommendations of that survey where yes was over 70% for all of those questions? All those in favour, please raise your hand. Thank you, everyone. I know lumping them all together feels like...
your hand.
Oh gosh, sorry. I know all of those together, lumping them all together feels like yesterday at 5 o'clock where democracy wasn't at its strongest, but I think that feels okay. So we've got one, I think we're unanimous on that one, Kev.
We seem to be. Would you like to ask if there are any that are against or abstain?
Please lower your hands. Mr. Musk, as you raised it yesterday, and anyone abstaining or against. Okay, so thank you, Kevin. I think that we can approve those 4. The next one was question 5. The 2025 to 26 hourly rates are proposed at £6.56 for the 3 and 4 year olds, and £9.60 for the 2 year olds, and £13.35 for children under the age of 2. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you to AFC for putting our rates above. So, you know, the rates that were proposed by the government was 27p, 41p, and 59p. We're going from 27 to 31, 41 to 60, and 59 to 75. So thank you for freeing up that there. So 52.7 agree with those proposed hourly rates. 16.4% said they're not sure. 30% said no. What is clear in some of these is they're saying it's not enough. But my understanding, Scott, is we're not in a position to be offering any more at this position. So those that are saying it's not enough, we might agree with them, and of course we'd all want that more money, but I don't think they're saying no to the increase. I don't know if I'm inferring that wrong, and if there are any questions on that. Okay, so I'm just going to go with a simple, while we recognise that it might not be enough, do Schools Forum agree with the increase that is above the recommendation? Oh, go on, Soph. Oh no, you're going for that. Does School Forum agree with the increase that is above the national increase, with us moving to use the 97% rather than just the 96% as well? Okay. Thank you, everyone. I won't make the hubris decision yet that that is unanimous, but if we can lower our hands, does anyone, I'm slowing down. Sean, if you just bring your hand down and stop ordering the pizza, mate. Is there anyone that wishes to abstain or counter that? Okay, thank you, everyone. So on the question of the 2025-26 hourly rates, we have unanimously agreed, and thank you, everyone, for doing that. Okay. I believe we have noted and agreed all of those. I believe we have voted on those. Scott, Melanie, is there anything else on those that we need to be doing? Thank you very much for both your work on those things. I recognize the amount of work that goes into it. Kevin, anything else on that item that hasn't been covered off?
I don't believe so. It all seems to be covered.
Thank you. Other than the update that I put, so moving to the next item, obviously, again, to repeat that update of what we said in terms of the NEU facilities time, that will go into the meeting in June, which is the 23rd of June on a Monday. Are there any other updates? Sophie Kavanagh, you've raised your hand, please.
Just a query on the NEU. Who will provide an update to Paul Coles that it's been moved to June?
I did that this afternoon.
Well done. Thank you, Ash.
Yeah, so he emailed and I gave him a quick call just to go through it all. And, you know, I think it was important to do that. And I really wanted to make sure that they recognize it wasn't some sort of Machiavellian thing. It was simply hands tied by the conventions and constitution of the way Schools Forum operates. Any other updates from people? Well, unless anyone else wishes to stay on this call for the next 55 minutes, I think we're in a position where, thank you, everyone. As always, thank you, everyone at AFC, for the work that you do on what we take sometimes too much for granted. So thank you. Thank you all for taking your time there. Have a lovely evening. And what we'll do in the NEU stuff is after those meetings tomorrow, we'll gather everything together and make sure we're prepped for that. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ash. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, mate, as always.
Thanks, Scott, Claudia. Right. Thank you, Claudia. Good to see you. Cheers.